Hello folks, welcome back to World War II TV. I hope you had a good weekend, and we are starting off 6 shows about the 8th Air Force, which is all going to be leading up to hopefully a lot more shows in 2023 when the Masters of the Air series finally airs in whichever platform and however that'll be, which I was just talking about with my guest. But when we think of the 8th Air Force, and especially the early part of its role in World War II, 42, 43, people talk about the aircraft types not being quite suitable, like the latter models of B-17 being better than the earlier ones, the fighter change from P-47s to P-51s, things like that. But actually, one of the big problems that was the 8th Air Force had to address in those early years was just agreeing what to do, setting up the doctrine, working with the British and the other nations about exactly what they were going to do to defeat the Germans. And so to cover that aspect, my guest today, Professor Luke Truxal, who has been on before talking about the bombing of Romania, is going to talk about the United Air Command. So I'll bring him in a second. Before I do, if you have just found World War II TV and this is your first show, well, welcome aboard, and please consider becoming a subscriber. Click the little notification so you get the upcoming shows announced to you, and maybe consider becoming a patron and or YouTube channel member. But I'm going to bring in Luke now. So good afternoon, Luke. How are you today?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm very well. So, I said it in the introduction there. There's a lot of interest with the 8th Air Force is in the hardware. It's in the aircraft. It's in drop tanks later in the war, and engine changes and bomb designs and aircraft designs. But actually, part of the arc of the 8th Air Force's improvement was basically, as I just said there, that deciding on what policy was going to be, looking at the idea of taking the war to Germany and agreeing so that working with the British, they can defeat the Germans. So before we bring up your presentation, just explain to the viewers where your interest in this began and what you've been working on with regards to this subject.
My interest actually began when I was a master's student at the University of North Texas. When I had always been interested in the air war, going back to my days at Abilene Christian as an undergraduate student. But when I was looking at doing my thesis as a master's student, I wanted to write the book that always seems that people like to write, which is, what did Acre get wrong in 1943 as the commander of the 8th Air Force, and what did Doolittle get right in 1944, and focus primarily on Doolittle. I was in the office with my advisor at the time, Dr. Robert Cetina from the National World War II Museum. And he said, you really need to look a little more closely at 1943, because I know you want to write on 44 and Doolittle, but look a little more at 43. And I started looking at, when I went to the archives, I didn't know what to expect. And I found out there just seems to be an inability to get on the same page about what we're doing. And one of the things that I learned during this process, and I keep in mind when I talked about air power in World War II, is that we have to remember in World War II, air power is still very young. These are new ideas being tested. These are new planes being tested. And we're, strategic bombing, barely got tested in the First World War and on a very small scale. And so we see a lot of writing about it in the 1920s and 1930s with the Italian Giulio Douhet and also the American Billy Mitchell. We see Acre and Arnold write a lot about it in the mid to late 30s. William Sherman as well in the late 20s. And these ideas have not been tested. What to attack, how to attack it, what tactics to use, what tactics not to use. And we see not only the Americans struggling with this, we see the British struggling with this. We see the Luftwaffe struggling with this. How to escort, bombers to the target, what kind of tactics to use there, aggressive, not aggressive. And we see this in the Blitz, but also, your previous guest, I think it was Robert Kershaw, even talked about one of the lessons learned from the 1940 campaign was how to properly coordinate the Luftwaffe with ground forces. So again, a lot of these new ideas being tested in combat for the first time in the same way that we're seeing drones in Ukraine being used on a large scale for the first time in high intensity operations. And so there's going to be ideas. Nobody's on the same page because there's a lot of new ideas out there and everybody in some ways thinks they have the right one.
Well, I mean, you said yourself about the theories in the 1930s. It was lots of theories, lots of speculation, lots of ideas, lots of people with charts and the equivalent of 1930s PowerPoint saying we can achieve this. But until someone actually starts the ball rolling and starts doing things, they can't work out how it's not going to work to then improve and find out how it is going to work. But before we bring up your PowerPoint presentation, you've got some kind of exciting news about the fact that this work you've been working on is going to be coming out in the form of a book. So tell the viewers about that.
Yes. Basically, in the last month, I got the University Press of Kentucky basically agreed to publish my manuscript. And so I have a new book coming out next year at the end of 2023 called Uniting Against the Reich, the American Air War in Europe. So basically this will come out and be published in a book sometime in late 2023. I'm crossing my fingers it's not on October 14th, 2023. That would be the 80th anniversary of Black Thursday.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So, again, it's coming out sometime late in 2023, Uniting Against the Reich, the American Air War in Europe.
Well, it'll be a great time to bring out a book of that subject, because theoretically, we said there with Masters of the Air, next year is going to be a big one with a reanalysis and a re-examination of the role of strategic bombing generally, because the 8th Air Force will get the attention from this series, but of course it'll spread out to Bomber Command, it'll spread out to the other air forces around the world, and it'll be good for the aviation world, we hope. But anyway, we'll fire up your PowerPoint, and I'm going to hand over to Luke to take us, so he'll tell me when to move on the slides. And folks, I don't know that we'll need any questions as we go along. I think Luke is going to cover pretty much everything as we go along. But if you do have questions, fire away. If not, we'll do a kind of question and answer at the end. But basically, I'm going to hand over to my guest now to kind of take us through the command unity and the air war in Europe.
So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, since we've kind of introduced what's going on. What I'm looking at is there's two traditional narratives that historians kind of go to when looking at what went wrong in 1943 versus what went right. And the arguments can be summed up in, there's a materiel difference between 1943 and 1944, and there's a change in fighter tactics. With regards to the materiel, I want to say with these two narratives, I'm not discounting them in my upcoming book and also in my arguments. This is definitely valid. This is definitely a part of the narrative and should be discussed. In 1943, the 8th Air Force and the American Air Forces in Europe do have a shortage in bombers, fighters, logistics, drop tanks, you name it. They just don't have enough, even pilots and gunners. So again, there's just a shortage of stuff. What generally gets talked about is the lack of a long-range escort fighter. Also, and we see a number of attempts to try to get around this. In fact, at one point, they experimented with taking the bombs out of a B-17, loading it up with a bunch of machine guns, and trying that as an escort fighter, but that didn't work. Now, why is there not really a long-range escort fighter in 1943? Some of that's the technology, but that technology wasn't really being emphasized in the interwar years, because there's this belief that the B-17 and the B-24 could defend themselves to the target and back and attrit an enemy air force and enemy fighter opposition in the process. Obviously, in 43, that gets proven wrong. Also, if you're going to be fighting an air wars tend to be attritional. So you need a number of aircraft. You need a large number of aircraft to maintain your air force and continue operations as you take losses over the course of time. And you're not talking about bombing on a narrow front or in a small theater. We're talking about bombing targets that include France, Germany, Italy, and by the end of the war, practically all of Europe. So you need a large air force to do that, not just to be able to conduct the missions, but also to maintain losses. You're going to take losses in the course of the fighting. Now, the final thing that gets brought up, with regards to the fighter tactics, I should point out, I do buy into that Doolittle's fighter tactics were an improvement, but how much of an improvement I think warrants some investigation. And the reason I say this is that I saw an article a couple of years ago, which really got me thinking, talking about how one fighter group in the 15th Air Force used the conservative fighter tactics that were being used by the 8th Air Force in 1943 and proved quite successful. In fact, there's movies made about them. It's the 352nd Fighter Group, the famous Red Tails. So, you know, one of the changes in fighter tactics that we see that Doolittle introduces with 8th Fighter Command is we see two changes. The first change is fighters no longer stick to the bombers. The fighters stick to the bombers up until the point of engagement. Once they engage the German fighters, they then pursue the German fighters and shoot them down. There's that famous sign that Doolittle had taken down in 8th Fighter Command that said the job of the 8th Fighter Command is to protect the bombers. He had it replaced with the sign that said the job of 8th Fighter Command is to shoot down German fighters. And so this is the first fighter change, more aggressive posture. Obviously, this leaves the bombers exposed, but they also have machine guns themselves, so you have attrition there. The other way is they introduced a bouncing fighter group, which would hover around the edge of the formation unattached to the bomber stream, looking for German fighters at their most vulnerable when they're setting up for their attacks. Now, the reason I say that this should be investigated more is I would like to see if 12th Fighter Command, 15th Fighter Command, and a couple of the other air forces are mimicking this. Now, I know 9th and 8th Air Force are doing pretty much the same thing, but I think if we looked at the 12th and the 15th Air Force, if they're doing the same changes that Doolittle introduced with 8th Fighter Command, then I think you have a better case that Doolittle's changes are having this bigger impact. If they're not, then I think we have to debate the conservative and more aggressive fighter tactics once again. So again, I think more research is, I'm not discounting this one, but I think there should be some more research done on this topic. So that brings me to my research, which is I wanted to break away from these two narratives, and I want to look at how does command unity work in all this. And one of the things I found is that getting on the same page is a problem. They're not coordinating their air forces in the against Germany very well. So something to keep in mind is going into 1942 and 1943, we have three major air factions in the European theater in 1942 and 1943. The two big ones are already kind of talked about ad nauseum. There is Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, which is based in England. Their doctrine is night area bombing, and their targets are German morale, cities, and civilians. Now, the reason they switched to this is in 1940 and 1941, they had tried daylight operations. One, bombing was very difficult. Accuracy was very difficult. Even with the Americans, accuracy in daylight bombing is very difficult. Accuracy is getting your bombs within 1,000 feet of the target. So that accuracy is, shall we say, not there. Also in daylight bombing, something the RAF learned was that you're going to take higher casualties. So when you have to switch to nighttime bombing to reduce your losses, your accuracy is going to go down even further. And so with the technology available at the time, the RAF kind of pursues a pragmatic, but I should also be blunt and say a bit more of a cruel doctrine of, well, the best way to attack the Germans is to attack their cities as a whole. It's the easiest target we can hit. It's the softest target we can hit. So we see them using more incendiaries, attacking German cities as a target and German morale. The Americans stick to this idea of daylight precision bombing, and that's where the 8th Air Force comes into place. The 8th Air Force pursues daylight precision bombing. They believe in the Norden bomb site, and they believe by attacking basically these key economic nodes or kind of choke points, they can bring the German economy to its knees. They just got to figure out what's the right one and to hit it. Now, initially in 1942, they don't get to target what they want to target because you have Operation Torch in November of 1942, the landings in northwestern Africa by the Allies. As a part of supporting that, they attacked German submarine pins all across the Brest Peninsula in France and primarily focused their targets on the French coastline and trying to basically destroy German submarine pins or at least keep their heads down. So that was done in support of Operation Torch. The 8th Air Force was not happy about that at all. Line up the commanders. Haywood Hansel, when he was there, didn't like it. He wasn't commanding the 8th Air Force, but he was commanding a bomb wing. But he writes a lot about how he was not happy about this. Ira Aker, if you look in his documents and his records, clearly states he was not happy about this. He calls it a distraction at one point. And in fact, he calls the entire North African campaign a distraction. At one point, he was so angry about it. But something also to remember why the 8th Air Force is unhappy. Right as they're getting built up, their two most experienced bomb groups get transferred to the newly formed 12th Air Force, which brings us to our third faction, the Air Forces participating in the North African campaign. And I say Air Forces because basically you have the 12th Air Force, but it's a part of the Northwest African Air Forces. And so these names kind of change around a bit in the order of battle. So if you're looking at the order of battle in the North African theater and the Mediterranean theater, it gets confusing because you have the 12th Air Force, which is also at times the Northwest African Strategic Air Force. So it does get a bit confusing, and it depends on what documents you're looking at as to what they're called. And even as a historian, there's some changes that you're just trying to figure out, okay, how do I write them in a book or even like an article or a paper I'm presenting? What do I call these guys? Because the names change a lot.
And would you just to jump in a bit, because Alex Black, who's watching, has written about the Fighter Command and Allied Air Force in support of Husky, and Mike Bechtold, who isn't watching, but he's written about air cooperation in the Western Desert. I think we think of the Mediterranean, North Africa as influencing fighter tactics, and particularly the whole, as you said earlier, the whole combined arms, ground, air, everybody working together. But I think probably the Mediterranean is overlooked in terms of influencing strategic bombing, because I think it's perceived by most people as kind of anti-shipping and a fighter campaign. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and you can't not talk about it, because what's happening is while they are supporting the ground war, and Alex Black's written a great book on this, but while they are supporting the ground war, you also have the 9th Air Force on the other side of North Africa supporting the ground war, but they're taking assets away from the 8th Air Force and its Strategic Bombing Command. Fighter groups are going. In fact, all the P-38s are going to the 12th Air Force. So all these assets, bomb groups, and not just bomb groups from the 8th Air Force, bomb groups that were initially going to be allocated to the 8th Air Force and Strategic Bombing Command are being allocated to North Africa. And so there's this huge divide amongst the Americans over the North African campaign, particularly amongst those supporting the air war. And also, let's not just discount commanders. Spaatz was the initial commander of the 8th Air Force. Well, he gets to command the Northwest African Air Forces. And as a result, you lose your top air commander. And while Aker does go up from 8th Bomber Command to 8th Air Force as a result of this change, and he does get promoted, he sees a lot of his most experienced commanders and pilots going to the 12th Air Force and going to North Africa, and it's making him mad, and for obvious reasons. So again, this is one of the things that, when he's talking to Churchill at Casablanca, and again, we can now go to the next slide. This does come up. So when we look at the Casablanca Conference, this is there's a lot discussed at the Casablanca Conference, but I'll stick to the air power debate. The big debate at Casablanca is Churchill decides kind of on his own, and I know you've probably read enough books to know Churchill had this tendency to kind of all of a sudden make an idea pops into his head and he's going to go do something. But against kind of the wishes of the Royal Air Force, particularly Chief Marshal Charles Portal, he decides to bring up the whole night bombing versus day bombing debate. And he decides, let's convert the 8th Air Force to night bombing. Well, that was not going to happen. In fact, that was a Churchill idea. He presented it to Roosevelt, but the Americans, from Hap Arnold all the way down to Aker and all the staffs involved and their staff officers were absolutely adamant that wasn't going to happen, even though they do panic a bit at Casablanca. And Aker gets called in from England to fly immediately to Casablanca to talk to Churchill about it. What Aker actually realizes is there's an opportunity here to break away from the North African campaign, which the 8th Air Force has been supporting up to this time with the attacks on the submarine pens, and also to prioritize his 8th Air Force. So the traditional narrative is this is a night versus daylight bombing debate, and it was in doubt. It was never in doubt. The Americans were going to stick to daylight bombing. And there's this also idea that the Casablanca Compromises and the Casablanca Directive were a success, round-the-clock bombing. It's an agreement to disagree. over doctrine. It's you go do your thing, we'll go do our thing, you know. And what they decided to do, the real thing that we see here is if you look at Acre's Casablanca notes and you look at his presentation to Churchill and you look beyond the night versus daylight bombing debate, North Africa comes up again and again and again. And that was the thing I was shocked by when I went and looked at his Casablanca presentation to Churchill, is he talks more about North Africa being a problem than he does about, you know, all the other things happening in his own theater of command. And so this is a debate about resources being diverted to the North African theater and the air war against Germany. So Acre, who commands the 8th Air Forces, proposes this idea of, and Churchill likes it, which is called round-the-clock bombing. And what the Casablanca Directive agrees is, yes, we're going to have a combined bomber offensive, but in those directives, if you read into the details, each Air Force commander is going to be allowed to kind of pursue their own agenda, which is bad. Because Spaatz, besides supporting Eisenhower wants the strategic air forces to support the ground war and do long-range interdiction. Spaatz, as soon as he gets in range of the Ploesti oil refineries, wants to attack those, and he wants to attack oil. He's obsessed with it. Acre wants to go after ball bearings and German aircraft production, and Bomber Command wants to go after German morale. So what's going to happen is they're all going to pursue their own separate air offensives in 1943 as a result of this. And even as they start building the operational plan to implement the Casablanca Directive, Operation Point Blank and the Point Blank Directive, they keep leaving like little bitty loopholes for these guys to basically choose to not support each other. So it's everybody kind of doing what they want to do. And that's bad, because what it allows the Germans to do is withstand some of these blows and also deliver some of their own against these air forces who become isolated. And so it really is a bad idea. And so the Casablanca Directive is a failure. So if you want to criticize Acre, there's a lot of things outside of Acre's control in 1943 that he doesn't have control over. He doesn't have a long-range escort fighter. He doesn't have the size of the Air Force that he wants. Some of that's on, to be blunt, Hap Arnold sending aircraft to North Africa. Some of that's on Spaatz. Some of that's on Eisenhower. Some of that's on just the U.S. production not reaching the levels it needs to support that kind of a air campaign. But if you want to blame Acre, here it is. He broke command unity as a compromise because no one could agree.
Just a question for you, Luke. But in the middle of 1943, how much predictive power does Acre have to know just how many aircraft and men are going to be available in the months to follow? Because, you know, we know that at this point, the 8th Air Force has not yet got anywhere near its peak of personnel and aircraft in the UK, but it is going to be coming. I mean, this is the era of pilots and crews going through training by the 1,000 a month and aircraft production being cranked up. So how much is he aware of the ability to increase the size of the 8th Air Force in the future?
That is a great question, and I'm going to try to answer it. I'm going to try to pick my words very carefully, I guess you could say. There are planning documents that he has that state what they expect the levels to be at a certain point during the war. There's the famous American pre-war plans, AWPD-1 and AWPD-42, that state that he's going to have at some point down the road thousands of bombers, you know, and the level of number of bombers is quite a bit. And in fact, they get pretty close to those levels in 1944 and 1945. What he knows he's going to get in 1943, I think he thinks he's going to get more than what he's given. That's the best way I can put it, because one of the things that keeps coming up in the spring of 43 and in the summer of 43 during this buildup period before Operation Point Blank kicks off is that he is writing letters to George C. Marshall, to Hap Arnold, to Eisenhower, and also to Spaatz, and it's all about North Africa again. And he's saying you're diverting bomb groups that are allocated to the 8th Air Force or bombers allocated to the Air Force towards your air forces. Stop doing that. In fact, he accuses Spaatz of stealing bomb groups at one point, putting it in writing, saying, stop stealing my bomb groups. And so I do think he thinks he's going to have more, but how much he actually understands he's going to get, I think that's a good question, because we do know what on paper the Army Air Forces said they could do before the war, but what he actually thinks in 1943 can get, I don't know. He does have numbers written on paper, but again, I don't know if he expects to actually get those numbers. That's the thing that I've always kind of struggled with when looking at what does Aker believe. He puts a lot of numbers on paper that he thinks he can get, but in reality, is he actually just putting more numbers on paper to just try to convince them to send more bombers his way? I do know this. In the spring and early summer of 1943, he knows he doesn't have enough. During this buildup period, he knows he doesn't have enough, not nearly enough. And more keep getting transferred to North Africa and the Mediterranean theater of operations, which is why he's panicking and which is why he's angry in spring and early summer of 43. So again, I can't give you like a raw number that he expects, but he does expect more than what he's getting, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think it's a good point because, the panic about seeing aircraft and material go to North Africa and being spread across other theaters, the fact that he just hasn't got enough of everything, we need to remind ourselves that he only has the information he has in 1943. And we, as historians, we know the arc improves. We know what happens. We know things get better. We know all that. But it's important to remind ourselves that we've got to give him the ability, remind ourselves that he only has the ability to know what he knows at the time. And we can scan that whole 6 years of war now and see the changes. But let's move on to the fallout from Casablanca.
Well, we see this actually put into action. We're seeing this now tested. And the first big test comes during Blitz week, where the RAF and the 8th Air Force try to coordinate air operations against basically northern Germany. And we see a lot of losses suffered by the RAF and by the 8th Air Force, but we don't really see, we see a lot of failure. And in fact, the Americans point to basically this is not a successful Blitz week. The RAF, I don't know if they might have, again, this is where an RAF historian would probably be better suited to talk about what they thought of Blitz week. But I know the Americans and the 8th Air Force were absolutely disappointed with this. And the big raid that they're disappointed with and that they believe proves that round-the-clock bombing doesn't work, and I think even Donald Miller in his Masters of the Air writes about this, is the Hamburg raid. In the Hamburg raid, the fires created by RAF's Bomber Command and the firestorm created by Bomber Command obstructed the bomb sites and the views of the 8th Air Force. And therefore, they can't really accurately hit their targets. They have to change their targets. They try to hit the submarine pins. That's a struggle. And so over the course of this 1 week of bombing, where the RAF Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force actually do try to coordinate their operations in the same theater, the takeaway by Aker and the takeaway by the 8th Air Force is we can't work with these guys because as soon as they start these fires, the smoke's going to come up and make it really hard to see our targets and hit them. And we have to either go to secondary targets, which was the submarine pins at Hamburg, and even that's a struggle, or we have to go find different targets. And so putting bombers over the same target, and the only way the Americans could actually effectively coordinate at that point is if they abandoned precision bombing, because they can't see the target. And so the big takeaway from Blitz week by the Americans is we can't bomb the same targets as Bomber Command with the technology that we have, because with the smoke coming up from the fires, we're not going to be able to see the target. And so that's the first big sign that something is wrong. But as we will see, is there's several crises that hit the 8th Air Force in 1943. The first being and not just the 8th Air Force, I should point out the American Air Forces in Europe. And the first being the Ploesti raid in 1 August of 1943. So again, this is conducted actually by the 9th Air Force, but 3 B-24 groups, the 44th, 93rd, and 389th, are transferred from the 8th Air Force's 2nd Air Division to Louis Brereton's 9th Air Force for this mission in the summer of 1943. Spaatz wants to use these B-24s to augment a B-24 force of 5 bomb groups to launch a low-level strike on the Ploesti oil refineries, believing that if he launches one successful raid against these refineries and he hits them, then he will knock out a ton of German oil or Romanian oil, and Germany won't get that, and it'll create an oil crisis. So it's kind of this like ideal American scenarios. Here's a choke point. Let's hit it. Let's destroy it. And that's what he wants the B-24s for. Interestingly enough, Eisenhower too wants the B-24s, but not for the same reason as Karl Spaatz. And they're like headquartered next to each other, which is interesting too. Eisenhower wants the B-24s to support operations in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. And so he uses these B-24s to do long-range air interdiction missions to support his ground operations in those theaters. And Aker can see right through this. He's like, you're clearly not using them for Ploesti, and you shouldn't be bombing Ploesti. So there's this huge fight over these three B-24 groups. And Eisenhower at one point proposes, okay, Aker's worried about losing control of his B-24s. Here's an idea. How about we do a transfer of B-17s to the Mediterranean Theater of Operation, and not just a little. I can't remember exactly the number, but it would have been a huge chunk of the 1st Air Division. And so we would be talking about another possibly 3 to 4 bomb groups from the 8th Air Force. And just to make Aker feel better, we'll put him in command of all the 8th Air Force units here in the Mediterranean Theater. And then we'll go, and then he can do what I want him to do, which is continue these long-range air interdiction missions. Aker doesn't buy that. Spaatz still wants these for his Ploesti raid. Eisenhower's delaying that thing as much as he can because he wants them for air interdiction. Aker wants these B-24s back for his Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission later that August. And so throughout June and July, these guys are fighting over these 3 B-24 groups and possibly even more than that. And they all want to bomb 3 different things. Finally, it goes up to George C. Marshall because this just gets really nasty, this huge fight between these 3 guys. And Marshall has to play the parent in the room. And he basically says, okay, Aker's B-17s are not going to the Mediterranean Theater. That's done. That idea's gone. And the B-24s, either use them against Ploesti or hand them back to the 8th Air Force. And after you use them against Ploesti, hand them back to the 8th Air Force. Now, one of the other objections that Aker brought up in this argument, which I think is actually very valid and should be pointed out, is he kept pointing out, he's like, what are you going to do after you hit Ploesti the first time? If you hit just Ploesti, there are other oil refineries in the Balkans. There's crude oil all across Romania and in other parts of the Balkans. You hit those, they're going to repair them. Are you going to follow it up? Are you going to kind of police your bomb, do kind of a policing bombing, maintaining the effects? Because targets get repaired all the time. And so Aker brings up all these great objections of, one, you got to coordinate this operation. You're going to have to bomb the refineries at Ploesti. Then you're going to have to follow it up, but also you're going to have to bomb refineries across Europe if you want to create the oil effect that you're looking for. So Aker even points that out. So I will say Aker does warn a lot about what's going to happen at Ploesti, saying that this is a bad idea, that you shouldn't be doing this unless you're willing to like bomb it repeatedly and in a more coordinated fashion across the continent of Europe. So again, ultimately, Eisenhower loses the fight. The B-24s get allocated to the Ploesti raid with the 9th Air Force. And as soon as that raid is done, they have to get transferred back to the 8th Air Force. And this is Marshall's call at this point. So we see finally the 1 August Ploesti raid, which is an abject failure. 53 B-24s lost. And while they did hit the targets, they did a lot of damage. When we talk about like the effects, Aker was right. They're able to, over time, repair the refineries, get oil production back up. There's no oil crisis in Germany yet. And we see them being able to withstand the blow. And at the same time, the Germans and the Romanian Air Force in Romania are able to exact a high toll. And these 3 B-24 bomb groups are out of action for a while. So Aker's not going to be able to use them for the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, which is a big part of that mission with the raid on Regensburg and then going down south towards North Africa. So he's going to have to use B-17s with additional tanks to basically extend their distance. So the second major crisis we see is on part of this is with the loss of the B-24 force from his planned double strike, Aker now has to rely on a much smaller B-17 force to do the Regensburg run, and these have upgraded fuel tanks so they can make it all the way to North Africa. This raid gets put off also quite a bit, but a lot of it is trying to find the right weather conditions, because the first part of this raid is a distraction force of B-17s will strike the aircraft factories at Regensburg, then fly south to North Africa and land. Well, you got to fly them early enough so that way they hit the target and then land in North Africa with enough light to see the runways. Secondly, the other thing you have to deal with is, you have to deal with weather over the target, and weather becomes the big problem with this raid. And what happens is these two forces are supposed to launch at the same time. The one that's supposed to attack the Schweinfurt ball bearings is supposed to launch right after the Regensburg force. It keeps getting delayed, and finally it's kind of put up or shut up time. And the commander of 8th Bomber Command, Major General Frederick Anderson, is just sitting there in his office trying to figure out what to do. And it's, once again, it's weather's good enough to launch the first force, and they're more experienced so they can navigate some of the bad weather. But the more greener force, which is doing the Schweinfurt raid, they're going to have to delay that one. And what happens is it's a total disaster. The Luftwaffe basically smashes the diversionary force, which was kind of expected. They land, they refuel, but also because the Regensburg force had already gone, reinforcements were coming in from other parts of Germany because they could see that Schweinfurt force getting ready. And so when the Schweinfurt force comes, they actually face more German fighters than the distraction force or the diversionary force. And so this too is a heavy defeat for the 8th Air Force. And again, I feel bad for Frederick Anderson, because this is a big raid and you're thinking about having to give the go or no go. And you're really at the point of, we either have to scrap this mission for a long time, or, I have to send them out in a really not ideal scenario, and it blows up in his face, and it blows up in Akers' face. And so we have kind of a bit of a short operational pause after these two raids, where basically the American air forces in Europe are licking their wounds. So if we can move to the next slide.
Yep.
During this pause from about August 18th to October 1st, Arnold expresses he's really unhappy with the progress. In fact, the anticipation, according to Allied planning documents, is that they're going to achieve air superiority over the Luftwaffe in Europe sometime by the end of 43. In fact, October 43 at the earliest. They're not even close to that. It's pretty clear. More bombers now, because of the crisis and the losses, get diverted to the 8th Air Force. We now start to see a greater emphasis being put on the 8th Air Force for the first time, versus it kind of being, having the leftovers, shall we say, in the early part of 43, while 12th and 9th get a little bit more. One of the interesting things that also happens during this pause is the 8th Air Force participates in a deception operation known as Operation Starkey, which is really fascinating. The whole operation itself, I came across this. What happens in Operation Starkey is there's a fake landing taking place in northern France near Pas-de-Calais. And the idea is they're trying to keep German troops from being transferred from France to Italy for the fighting in Italy. That's what they're trying to do. It failed for a number of reasons. In fact, the famous Agent Garbo nearly got busted during Starkey. But what happened is they just didn't put enough into it. The 8th Air Force is involved, but you needed a larger landing force or fake landing force to sell it. They learned a lot of lessons from Starkey as a deception operation. But Aker and Arnold tend to get fooled by their own operation, because the Germans just don't bite. They just go, eh. They don't see it as a fake. They just don't see it as anything to worry about. They put their troops on an alert. They go, it's an alert, but it's not like a panic, hold troops there. And that's all they do. Aker and Arnold come away, well, because the Luftwaffe didn't react to our bombings, because the Luftwaffe didn't try to intercept us, it's because we're actually doing better than what we thought. And so you have a multitude of factors now pushing this big October push, whereas at the end of August, they're thinking, man, we got hammered. Towards the end of September, they're thinking, wait a minute, maybe we killed more German fighters and did better than what we thought we did because of Operation Starkey. But also you have to think Aker's also being influenced to believe things in a more optimistic light because he's got to show Arnold progress. And Arnold's really on his case. And for those not familiar with Hap Arnold, he was notorious for putting pressure on his subordinates. It wasn't uncommon for him to fire an Air Force commander that he really liked because he was not happy with progress. And what Arnold always seemed to fail to understand is sometimes operations take time, especially strategic operations and strategic bombing, takes time to get the effects that you desire. And so he never really understood that lag time. So it was not uncommon. He really gave Spaatz at the end of the Battle of Bulge a nasty little letter. Acre, he really berated right around this time. And so Acre's under pressure to show results. And now this deception operation seems to indicate, hey, one more push, and I think they fold. So again, it really shows how Acre's grasping to show progress, but at the same time, it also shows how a deception operation can also fool the person trying to deceive the enemy. So it's one of those fascinating operations that I came across in research, which shows Acre's mindset going into October of 43. So if we can go to the next slide. Yeah. The October push is a major crisis. Acre loads up and sent raid after raid into Germany. And instead of looking at these raids kind of, picking out one raid, pick out any raid. And it's a disaster. I think the Marienburg raid, the 100th Bomb Group loses all but maybe one or two of its B-17s. And, we see bomb groups getting decimated. And then there's the famous 14 October second raid against Schweinfurt. And this one is really, it's brutal. 60 heavies are lost during the mission. But beyond that, there's a lot more that when they get back to England are either having to be scrapped and are considered lost by the time they land, that they're not being able to repair them, or they're out for so long due to repairs that they're gone. They're gone for a long time. So we see with the October push in 43, and again, there are so many missions to go over here that just went bad. But the Schweinfurt one is the one that sticks out because that's the big one. And what Acre takes away from Schweinfurt is he thinks he won. He thinks by the end of this, it's like, just keep pushing. It'll work. And that's what he keeps thinking. And after the 14 October raid where he loses 60 heavies, and I think you have to write off another 17 more when they get to the ground, and then you add in the other, dozens that are shot up that need to be repaired. And there's a disconnect. The guys that flew the mission knew they lost. They knew they got beat. But Acre thinks they won. In fact, he writes a letter to Arnold saying, I think we won. We have the Hun by the neck. They're desperate. This is it. They're about to collapse. Well, again, you throw in Operation Starkey, what he thinks is happening to the Luftwaffe, that they're about to collapse. We just got to keep pushing this attritional war. You think about kind of the pressure he's under to show results, but also they did hit the target at Schweinfurt. They hit the ball bearing facilities. But what Germany had been able to do is with these attacks on the aircraft industry and also the attacks on the ball bearings, they're able to withstand these blows because, one, they can buy ball bearings from Sweden, which basically helps them offset the losses. They had plenty more in storage. And one of the things you have to be careful when looking at strike photos is while the target showed it was destroyed in the strike photos, not as many of the machines got destroyed. And so the aircraft industry and the ball bearing facilities were able to withstand this blow. And also, again, no follow-up raids, no attacks in other theaters against German aircraft industry. So Germany did get hit hard. I'm not saying they didn't, but they're able to withstand the blow and inflict greater losses on the 8th Air Force that they can't maintain this operation. And so there's this culmination point that happens in November of 1943, this realization that when the poor weather starts moving in, when they look at the fact that they can't maintain operations anymore, that they're licking their wounds, they realize that we lost. There's a realization. It takes till about a week or two in November where they realize we lost. Acre writes about this in a letter saying that if you'd have given me more bombers, and you wouldn't have kept sending them to the Mediterranean theater, then I would have won. And so we see a realization that they had lost by November of 43, which kind of leads to kind of a lessons learned. And one of the things that we look at and the lessons that are being taken away from this, we talk about the long-range escort fighters, Akers pointing out to the lack of enough bombers to the air war against Germany. Well, another one that they're starting to kind of put together is that they're kind of all going different ways. They need to focus their air forces and coordinate them better on a single strategic target system. And this is where Eisenhower gets into play, and we see kind of a reorganization of the American Air Forces starting in the fall of 43 and continuing on into the winter. Now, the dates I put up here are not when the reorganization takes place. This is when these air forces are founded, so don't get confused by that. But let's just talk about what the 8th Air Force does. The 8th Air Force will transfer its older P-47 fighters, which are better suited for close air support, and to the 9th Air Force, which will be doing more of the tactical bombing and close air support for Operation Overlord. Something to remember in the background is this is all being done to support Overlord. There's a realization they got to push fast and defeat the Luftwaffe and start making gains in the air war because Overlord is coming. The 9th Air Force, that is really interesting what happens at the end of 43 with those guys. The 9th Air Force is initially located in Italy, in North Africa, the Mediterranean theater. What they do with the 9th Air Force, and this should be a book in itself, the 9th Air Force, because there's two halves to it. They take all the air sets out of them, and they allocate all the tactical units and move them to all the tactical bombers and all the fighters. They move to the 12th Air Force. At the same time, they take all the strategic bombers in the 9th Air Force and move it to the 15th Air Force. The 9th Air Force has now lost all of its air assets in the Mediterranean theater. And again, there are going to be additional bombers brought in from overseas and stateside to augment the 15th Air Force as well. But the 9th Air Force headquarters still exists. It's still the 9th Air Force, but it moves to England with its commander, Louis Brereton, and they build a new 9th Air Force around this headquarters. So, we don't talk enough sometimes, we talk about how units change and organizations change. Sometimes a corps is not a corps. Sometimes a division is not a division. Yes, there's a headquarters division, but sometimes it actually only has like 3 regiments because they're moving units around. That's what's happening with the 9th Air Force. So the 9th Air Force gets transferred and rebuilt back up in the United Kingdom, where it'll be a tactical air force only.
And is there some new blood coming into the 8th Air Force and indeed the 15th and 12th? Because things are finished in Sicily now. The Mediterranean is kind of not winding down, but it's definitely peaked now. So where personnel had been going to the Med earlier in the war, I'm guessing some key people are coming back. Because when we talk about people like Aker and Doolittle and anybody else, we're not mentioning the fact that all of these people have staffs. They have people there who are with them, who are offering advice, who are doing some of we call it, the number crunching and the data analysis that is integral to understanding. You talked about Aker, being a bit kind of swayed by the strike photos and maybe not noticing the fact that the morale of the men who's been flying the missions is pivotal. So is it important that there are some personnel coming back now?
Oh, there are. Eisenhower, one of the things you got to remember is Eisenhower had gotten used to a certain air command team around him. In fact, Aker, when he fires Monk Hunter as 8th Fighter Commander, he wanted Pete Quesada to run 8th Fighter Command at the end of 43. And basically, there's a huge fight over Pete Quesada. And basically, Spaatz and Eisenhower said, no, you're not going to get Pete Quesada. I don't care what you say. And we know it's a promotion for him. We know it's a big promotion for him. You're still not getting him. So again, they're bringing their staffs. They're bringing, and also I will say there are 8th Air Force staff that are going to be staying as well. Again, in fact, Frederick Anderson from the Schweinfurt-Regensburg grade of 8th Bomber Command will eventually get promoted because, again, there's basically this reassessment that we got to move people around. And it's not a matter of firing people in a lot of cases. Yes, there's some people that do get fired, but that actually doesn't happen as often as you think it does. A lot of it is we got to put them in the right spot. Yeah. And that's actually what happens more often is they start plugging people into the right command position. So you see a transfer of air command staff over. You see a lot of Eisenhower bringing in his own guys. But with the 8th Air Force, what you see is less people getting fired and more people getting kind of moved into a spot that better suits them.
But in an interesting way, it connects with the fact that as aircraft are being shifted to the role that better suit them, the personnel are also being shifted, but that kind of gets overlooked in a narrative because it's not as exciting as as the photos of the various aircraft models. And then, it's interesting that the sidebar is full of chats about the ME-262 and things, as it always is on an aviation show, because the gear, the tech is always very fascinating. But actually, shuffling of the personnel can be just as important to the smooth running as the shuffling of the actual material.
I mean, I'll admit some of what this book that I'm publishing is it's a bit of an administrative history, and it's not as fascinating sometimes as talking about the equipment or the tactics or the battle plans. But there are people here that work better, and again, some of this is about relationships. Who works better with who? Yeah. So it's not just a matter of, is this guy talented enough? Should we put the right guys together to get the most out of them? Because some personalities clash and some don't. And again, that's one of the things that I see change a lot between 43 and 44 is they're really thinking about, if you're going to coordinate air operations across the European theater, you need to make sure you have the right guys in the right spot that know how to work together, even going back to their days in the 1920s and 30s. So that's why I say Aker, I initially, when I read James Parton's biography of Aker, I was like, well, of course, Parton's going to say Aker didn't get fired because Parton was Aker's staff officer. But the more and more I looked at it, nobody gives a good reason why Aker gets kind of kicked up to the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces. And then I found an interview with Spaatz, and we'll see it later, where basically he says, well, there's a reason. And that reason is I like him there. And I want him there, so it's more of a better plug and play. And again, we are seeing kind of these formations change. And as these formations change, so do the personnel so that, again, that is a great question. Something to point out is, and again, you can kind of see right on here, what is all changing, but a lot of personnel are shifting. I'm going to talk about the big ones, but there's a lot of staff, a lot of lower level guys that change. And we see that with the 9th Air Force. And again, I've already kind of talked about the 12th and 15th Air Force, so we can kind of move beyond that. So again, the biggest change in 43 and 44 is Eisenhower is now Supreme Commander. And when Eisenhower's Supreme Commander, one of the things they wanted to do with the Overlord operation coming up on 6 June 1944, again, we know it was slated for May and it gets delayed, but one of the things that Eisenhower really wants, and also the guys around him wants, and some of the members of the Combined Chiefs of Staff want, is they want Eisenhower to have control over these air forces for Overlord, whether it's at the tactical, whether to use them tactically like he did in the Mediterranean several times, operationally for, air interdiction missions, or just for the strategic bombing campaign. So that way it works better with what's going on in the ground war. And there's this realization that the ground war and the air war kind of work together. And so that's why Eisenhower, one of the things when he's appointed is there's this, both Eisenhower wants it, but also people around Eisenhower realize he needs to have greater control over these air forces. Now, it's not saying he's making tactical decisions, planning out missions. This is not like, Vladimir Putin in Ukraine moving, brigades around. This is, we need somebody to basically say, what are we doing? What is the vision of the air war? What is the big picture? Who's handling big picture? And one of the things that we sometimes tend to forget is Eisenhower is really good at big picture. He's good at saying, I don't need to move units on the battlefield all the time. But what I need to do is say, what are we doing as a whole? Where is our end goal? And so that's where he plays the biggest role. And so in addition to those changes, he is going to try to centralize the American air commands around him. Now, the RAF and Bomber Command, that's complicated. It's a lot easier for Eisenhower to move the American air commands around and basically unify them under his command because, well, he's the top guy and he's an American. Bomber Command's a little bit more complicated because that's a different air force belonging to a different nation. And so there are some interesting politics at play here. One of the ways in which Eisenhower tries to improve coordination with Bomber Command is he appoints Arthur Tedder as Deputy Supreme Commander. He makes sure Tedder gets that job. Why? He says he wants Tedder to be, quote, his chief air officer. He's the guy he wants to basically run the air war. Basically, I'll approve all the big plans, but you're going to be making sure everybody's on the same page. And so he'll be working with trying to get Arthur Harrison Bomber Command on the same page with Karl Spaatz, and the new formation, which is now known as the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe. Spaatz gets this new command, which basically unifies all American strategic air forces under his command, the 15th and the 8th. But you also have to remember the 8th is also a part of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, and they are also carrying out operations in support of the fighting in Italy, which means they might be, you might have some command disagreements. So Spaatz takes Acre from the 8th Air Force, which he did not want to go. He makes it very clear he doesn't want to leave the 8th Air Force. He says it's like being pulled in the 9th inning of a big game or something like that. You know, a American baseball reference. But Acre gets moved to this new command and put in charge of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces. That way, Spaatz now has a guy he trusts, a guy he's worked with since the 1920s, in command of those air forces, which means the 12th and the 15th Air Force also report to Spaatz in a indirect way, either through Acre. You know, so Acre can basically make sure that the 15th Air Force is coordinating with the 8th Air Force, and at times, so will the 12th. Portal continues to coordinate the combined bomber offensive. He's still in charge of coordinating that, but the reason why Portal was chosen is because he kind of let them go their own way. He didn't really try to centralize the Allied air commands. He had a loose grip on them. So he's still in charge technically of the combined bomber offensive, but really, if we're being honest here, it's Eisenhower, Tedder, and Spaatz who are now running the air war along with Acre. So I will point out, Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory had also been placed in command of the Allied Expeditionary Air Forces, which was to make him the supreme command authority for the Allied Air Forces. Problem: he doesn't get along well with others, doesn't play well with others, and Spaatz and Harris make it very clear that they're not going to follow his orders. And that's another reason why Tedder is so crucial as the kind of deputy supreme commander, because Tedder basically takes on that role of coordinating all the air forces. It was supposed to be Leigh-Mallory. Leigh-Mallory, by the time we get closer to Overlord, yeah, he has a command, but in name only. He becomes more of an advisor. You know, he has ticked off so many people. And I mean, we could go back to the Battle of Britain and what he did with Fighter Command and Big Wing and those debates. He was not popular in the RAF. He was not popular amongst the Americans. And I can give you numerous examples of where even Spaatz at times would not even go to some of the meetings that he was hosting. He would send Frederick Anderson, his now deputy commander of operations, to go to those meetings for him because he couldn't stand Leigh-Mallory. And so Leigh-Mallory did have this kind of effect where you can't have that guy in charge of coordinating the Allied Air Forces. And in fact, Churchill asked Eisenhower during the midst of all these problems with Leigh-Mallory in, March and April of 44, and he says, Churchill asked Eisenhower, who put Leigh-Mallory in charge? And Eisenhower's like, I don't know. Who did? It wasn't me. And so, again, it shows that this new air command team is clearly going to be Eisenhower. The air command team he's building is Tedder, Spaatz, and Acre, if we're talking about the kind of big three. So, Acre does get a bit of a promotion, an important one and all that. So if we can move to the next slide. And I think this proves the point of Spaatz really lays it. He does an interview after the war where he makes it very clear why Acre had to be transferred. And he says, if we're going to coordinate the operations with the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, it has to be Acre. I trust Acre. We've known each other for a long time. I'm technically senior to Acre, which helps. But the big thing is the relationship he and Acre have. They can talk to each other in a way that works very well with one another. So again, the thing that you always have to keep in mind is that these command changes are being made with who works best with who in mind. And so if you're going to coordinate operations, the relationship between commanders is vital. You can't have two commanders who hate one another being asked to coordinate operations. It typically doesn't work. Now, I'm not saying they have to be like best friends, but they have to have a good working relationship. And that's what Spaatz hits on. And in fact, there's another quote that Spaatz did in that interview that I didn't include on here, where he said, the whole key thing is it's Tedder, me, and Acre, along with Eisenhower. Those are the big ones. If any one of us was not in the right spot, we would have problems coordinating these air forces. So if we can move on to the next slide. Yep. This is the first big test, Operation Argument, which is it's the famous Big Week air battles. It's where Spaatz wants to launch both the 8th Air Force and 15th Air Force against the German aircraft industry, with the intent of basically bringing all the strategic air forces to bear on the German fighters and the aircraft industry. He's attacking German aircraft industry not just to destroy it, but to make sure the Germans show up. And he's going to try to basically coordinate this so that way the German fighters have to fight the 8th and 15th Air Forces coming from 2 different directions. It's a lot for these German fighter pilots to deal with. But there's a bit of a hiccup right before the operation kicks off. He's been planning this. He's got his clear weather. And the Germans launch a counterattack at Anzio, which the 15th Air Force is needed for. And it needs to be on standby in case there are follow-up attacks. Frederick Anderson, Spaatz's chief of operations, and Spaatz spend late nights, trying to see if they can get the 15th Air Force on board. Aker is pretty point blank as we still don't know the situation, how bad it is. We don't know if the Germans are going to continue pushing the attack. We need to wait. And he's not saying wait on the attacks. He says, we can join you once we know the Germans are clear. So Spaatz and Aker have these really heart-to-heart conversations. Eisenhower's looped in on it. And this is where we see a real big test. If this is going to fail, it's going to fail here. And because you got a ground operation that's distracting the 15th Air Force. Well, it just so happens that the 8th Air Force carries out the first 2 days of fighting, the first 2 missions. But as soon as Aker realizes that the situation at the beach is okay, they've now waited a few days, the Germans aren't going to press their counterattacks at Anzio, then the 15th Air Force participates the next 2 days. And over the course of that week of fighting and that coordination on those last 2 days, yes, the Americans take heavy losses, but the German fighters are having to fend off attacks from the 8th Air Force, fighters from the 9th Air Force. They're having to fend off the 15th Air Force as well. And so they're getting slammed and they're getting tired. And most importantly, their pilots are being attrited and dying. So the big effect of Big Week is not the destruction of the aircraft industry or even the destruction of really the Luftwaffe in the sense of its planes. It's the pilots. They lose a lot of experienced pilots over the course of a week of fighting. And as a result, what we see is these Luftwaffe post Big Week. And if we can go to the next slide, we can show you how this looks. If you can see in the bottom there, you can see the 15th Air Force carrying out its attacks in the south, while the 8th Air Force is carrying out its attacks in the north. And the Luftwaffe is bouncing around trying to fend off these attacks. And so it's really attriting them and bringing their ability to continue fighting, and it degrades the capabilities of the Luftwaffe. So the big takeaway from Big Week is that you lose a lot of experienced pilots and you don't have time to train new ones. And so the quality of the Luftwaffe and the German Fighter Command really goes downhill fast after Big Week. And over time, German fighters are going to be less and less of a threat as we get closer to Operation Overlord. And again, you can see on this map how those coordinations work and how the Luftwaffe has to defend attacks from multiple directions on the same day. So we can go on to the next slide. What we see after the Luftwaffe becomes less of a problem. It never fully goes away, but it becomes less effective. It's not a factor, I guess you could say. We see a debate over whether or not to go after transportation or oil. A transportation proposal is put forward, an oil proposal is put forward. Eisenhower makes the decision that we're going to go after transportation to basically set the stage for Normandy. But what also happens is Eisenhower really starts hammering home that we need to focus on transportation targets in the spring and early summer of 44. So we see 3 major air transportation bombing campaigns carried out. These are typically, they look like air interdiction missions, and they are to some level air interdiction missions. But if you look at the cumulating effect, you'll see that overall, you're hitting Axis transportation from France all the way to Romania, which is a wide area. So let's take a look at the first one, Italy and Operation Strangle. Operation Strangle basically was a plan by the 12th and 15th Air Forces to bomb German transportation and Italian targets, basically railways, bridges, marshalling yards, in order to limit the supplies of the German forces in Italy and force them to withdraw back from the Gustav line by bombing alone. Now, it didn't work that way. Bombing alone did not make the Germans withdraw. But what it did do is, in terms of the air interdiction side of the mission and the effects it had locally on the battlefield, it set the stage for, I believe it's Operation Diadem and the push to seize Rome. But if we look a little bit further and take a bigger picture, one of the ways the Germans were still supplying their troops and able to avoid withdrawing because of the supply shortages is when these rail yards are getting bombed and these bridges are getting bombed, the way they're getting around it is driving the supplies from the trains on the roads to the front lines. So what's happening? You're now using oil and gas. So when you start bombing oil targets later on, as the transportation networks start collapsing, the only way around it is to move it by motor. And that's going to eat your gas. And so we see accumulating effect. And basically, these things start to kind of work in unison together. So the next mission, the next major campaign we see is an air interdiction campaign to help the Soviet second and third Ukrainian fronts to seize Romania. Now, obviously, the ground campaign failed and the air campaign wasn't as successful with regards to helping the breakthrough. But what we see is, and we're seeing some of the effects of it today with the lower water levels on the Danube, is one of the ways in which the Germans are trying to get around losing the rail networks and having the rail networks and bridges being bombed is they're basically becoming more reliant on the Danube to ship their supplies and ship oil, but also ship supplies as well. Also, they're relying on the road network as well. And so, again, because of this, we see basically a greater reliance on trying to get around using railroads, which puts pressure on other economic systems. And also, it just so happens that I believe it's RAF 205 group mines the Danube River, which is one of the reasons we are starting to see shipwrecks come up as the Danube River kind of lowers as well. So again, it's a accumulating effect. We are now, other systems are being placed under greater pressure. And so this is causing problems. And then we can go to the third kind of example is the most famous transportation campaign for Overlord. And again, we see a lot of trains being hit, rail yards, and the other problem that's happening is Germany has to also produce more trains and locomotives to basically keep shipping supplies. And so again, if we look at the on-the-ground effect, this is why the German panzer divisions in Normandy and in the Normandy campaign have to move from their reserve area by road at night, and again, it's why they're slower. They can't get there as fast. But again, this creates a cumulative effect, which is the rail networks are coming down. They have to find ways around it. And it's either motor using the waterways, or it's quite literally using horsepower. So again, this is putting pressure on other parts of the German economy. So it's pretty effective. All right, so in 1944, in the summer of 1944, Spaatz was obsessed with bombing oil and bombing Romania. He finally gets approval for a large oil bombing campaign. And again, what we see happen is the 8th Air Force will be largely bombing synthetic oil refineries in Germany and Central Europe, while the 15th Air Force will be bombing the crude oil refinery process in the Balkans. And the results of this will be basically, you're basically hitting both parts of what Germany relies on with regards to oil, and it slowly creates an oil crisis. You compound this with what's happening to the transportation system and the rail network and the ways the Germans are finding to get around those obstacles, you're now making that oil crisis even greater. In addition, as a way to kind of permanently turn off basically the crude oil to Germany, the 15th Air Force will be conducting a number of operations in the summer of 44 to lay the groundwork for the Soviet offensives in the second Jassy-Chișinău offensive that succeed and destroy the German Sixth Army for the second time in the war. That never gets old. But again, the net result is now you have an oil crisis and a transportation crisis basically feeding off one another. And the results are pick your poison. How do you want to you got to use rail to basically offset the oil losses. But then again, your rail yards are getting bombed as well. So again, it's creating a number of transportation crises, both at the operational level, but at the strategic level as well.
Yep, brilliant. I'm just want to say how much I'm thoroughly enjoying this, by the way, Luke. That's why I'm not saying very much. So it's okay. Really, really brilliant. So anyway, yes, back to you.
So in September, things are going really well. And this is the time where you can make a mistake, and they nearly do. In September of 44, the justification for Eisenhower having so much control over the, shall we say, the vision of the air war is that basically it was Overlord. And now Overlord has happened, and we are seeing the breakouts, and we're seeing success. And success is very dangerous. You can sometimes make mistakes in success because you think, hey, we're rolling, things are good. And let's face it, the Allies do make a number of mistakes in September and October of 44 based on success in kind of that pursuit phase. You know, there's, again, there's the famous Market Garden operation, you know, so again, you see a temptation. And one of the temptations is, let's just go back to the way it was. This is all good. Overlord's over. Breakouts here. Strategic air forces can now be released from Eisenhower's control. Eisenhower immediately opposes this. The Combined Chiefs of Staff and Portal proposed this. And they say, listen, it was always a part of the plan to release the air forces from Eisenhower's control after Overlord. Well, Overlord's now over. Let's just kind of go back to the way things were. And Spaatz, to his credit, Spaatz and Eisenhower say, that's not going to happen. Now, they can't control Bomber Command, and I will say Bomber Command does break away, but I should point out that they're not breaking away as much as they used to. So they're not going back to where they were pre-1944, but they are a little bit looser. And this is why, like, when you talk about Bomber Command and this whole command system, it's a much more difficult story to write because you got to remember there's a different set of politics governing them than there are the American air commands. And it's a very difficult story to write because you got Harris, you got Churchill, you got Portal, all big personalities who have different visions of the air war. And then you got Tedder as well, who's trying to get it back into this system. So the American Air Forces all decide to stay together after this breakup. Bomber Command, shall we say, technically separates, but they do kind of try to stay roughly on the same page. Maybe not, you know, the same page, but they're at least in the same chapter, you know, if that makes any sense, you know. And so this could have been a near disaster. And again, it's headed off by Eisenhower, Spaatz, and some of the Strategic Air Force commanders who realize this needs to continue because it's working. And what we see, Tedder, from this point onward, he puts out these targeting directives. Here's the systems we're going to prioritize. Here's system number 1, list of targets. Here's system number 2, list of targets, 3, 4. 1 and 2, it changes, but it's the same 2. You know, it's transportation or oil. And depending on what they're seeing on the ground and the strategic effects that they're able to see taking place, basically they rotate the 2. You know, so again, also weather affects it as well. If you have poor weather and it's hard to hit oil targets, which are refineries, transportation targets, they use basically a radar system at this point. It's not very accurate, I should point out, but they do kind of a bit of area bombing near a transportation system. And again, you could point out that at this point, the Americans are moving closer and closer to area bombing, but I should say it's on transportation centers. And again, I'm not trying to justify what happens later with Dresden and all that, but I am trying to point out that in some ways, they are still trying to hit transportation targets to affect transportation and the movement of resources. You know, and again, if you want to see the full effects of this, Alfred Mierzejewski wrote a really good book on how this affected Germany's basically economy and how it affected just the rail bombing campaign alone, how it affected the German economy, just, you know, getting, you know, resources to the factories and getting the stuff out of the factories, you know. So again, there is it comes really close in September 44 to falling apart. And then these guys who had been instrumental in creating it decide they're not going to let it go. Again, they let Bomber Command go, but not the American Air Forces.
Well, just as well, because as we know, things then change in the winter of 44, 45, because everything had been going kind of the Allied way for a few months. Then the Battle of the Bulge occurs. So I'll hand it back to you.
Well, this is kind of a snippet of just kind of how effective this system can be, even if we're talking about not strategic bombing, but also, operational and tactical bombing. And again, I tell this story a little bit through the lens of what they do to the 6th Panzer Army. The Battle of Bulge is a shock. It shocks the Allied Air Command, shocks the Allied High Command. Eisenhower, Spaatz, and a few key leaders possess a really kind of calm, cool, collected, measured moment at Verdun. And, we could talk about all the changes that are made with First Army, Patton, and all that. What sometimes gets lost is what he does with the air commands, particularly the 8th Air Force. He does a lot of changes, and it's not possible without this centralized air command system in place to where Eisenhower can say, I want this, and this is how I want it. And Spaatz goes, yes, I agree. Let's do it. You couldn't do that in 43. And so what they do in the crisis is 8th Fighter Command's fighters effectively get transferred temporarily to the 9th Air Force to provide close air support, to aid in the breakthrough and stemming the tide. Furthermore, I don't know what Doolittle's response to this was. I really would love to see. I've had a hard time finding out what Doolittle would have said or done. I would love to know what his reaction to this was. But Spaatz and Eisenhower agreed to remove the 2nd Air Division, which is the B-24 division, from the 8th Air Force and put it directly under Eisenhower's tactical control. So Eisenhower now commands an air division. It's kind of crazy to think about when you think about all the other stuff he's dealing with in this crisis. He now has personal command of an air division. And he gets to use it to basically plug and play wherever there's a crisis where he needs to put the bombers in play. He can do it without having to go through the 8th Air Force and scheduling a mission. He just says, this is what I want, 2nd Air Division, go hit this target, go hit this transportation center, go hit this rail yard. So Eisenhower gets full command of that during the crisis. Also, the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe and Spaatz directed attacks against German supply lines all throughout the crisis. So the 8th Air Force is still aiding this effort. And so, again, if you look at how they're attacking this crisis, it's all together. It's in a coordinated fashion. And the command changes that they're doing, the little maneuvering around, the changing of the order of the battle that they're doing really in the span of 24 hours. These are big changes they're doing in the span of 24 hours. You couldn't do it like snapping your finger if you don't have a system where everything's centralized through Spaatz, Tedder, and Eisenhower, to where basically say, okay, this is what we need to do. This is how we fix the problem. Eisenhower needs this to kind of cut through any time delays. And here we go. And after the crisis, it all reverts back to the previous organization and it goes back to normal. So again, it shows you how swiftly they can respond to a crisis with this new system, which you could tell in 1943, as crises were developing, they couldn't respond to them because it's like, well, hey, that's your crisis. That's not my crisis. That's your issue. Well, yeah, we just had Ploesti. I can't really help you with Schweinfurt-Regensburg. That's a real problem in 43, but you don't see it here. And this shows kind of how effective this system is at basically being able to change things on the fly and respond to a crisis within hours. And so again, the German 6th Panzer Army is affected by this. But also, one of the interesting things, if we go to the next slide, Germany has one more offensive that doesn't get talked about a lot. Everybody talks about the Ardennes offensive as their last big roll of the dice. It's actually at Lake Balaton, right after the Battle of the Bulge. And the 8th Air Force is reorganizing and kind of getting back to what it normally looks like. The 6th Panzer Army gets transferred after the fall of Budapest to kind of what now is the Eastern Front, which is kind of interesting because the Eastern Front is shrinking so much. It's like Southeastern. But it gets transferred to the Eastern Front to carry out this last offensive to reverse the fall of Budapest and destroy one of the two Soviet fronts that had succeeded in its advances in the Balkans. And so what's interesting is the bombing of the supply lines of the German 6th Panzer Army quite literally get passed from the 8th Air Force to the 15th Air Force. A smooth transition. And as the 6th Panzer Army is getting ready for its big attack against the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts in Hungary, as they're getting ready for this, the 15th Air Force starts hitting their supply lines 2 days prior to the offensive. I mean, you think about the complexities of launching an offensive. And you're stressing the last 24 to 48 hours before it all kicks off. And then you find out 2 days before the big show, oh, we just lost our main supply hub, and we need to repair the rail lines to make sure the supplies keep coming to the front. That's a crucial moment right before everything kicks off. And on the 6th of March, the German 2nd and 6th Panzer armies attacked the 3rd Ukrainian front at Lake Balaton in an attempt to isolate and destroy that 3rd Ukrainian front. During the offensive, the 15th Air Force once again strikes the 6th Panzer Army's supply lines. And as a result, one of the problems that the 6th Panzer Army is dealing with is logistical, having a hard time getting the supplies up. Now, obviously this time of year, weather is a problem, but the fact that the rail lines are getting hammered along with the poor weather basically means that it's really hard for the German 6th Panzer Army to get its supplies to the front because of these bombings. And so by 14 March, this offensive that had only lasted, 8 days, has to stall. It stalls out and fails. And then it's time for the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts to hit back. And when they do, because of the stretched supply lines and also because of the loss of tanks, both in the Ardennes offensive and also the Battle of Lake Balaton, they get hit back pretty hard. And I think, the commander of the 6th Panzer Army, Sepp Dietrich, famously said, 6th Panzer Army's right. We only have 6 tanks in our entire army, But by 13 April, the offensive not only been stalled, but by 13 April, the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts had captured Vienna. So what it shows, and this is just a snapshot on a tactical level of what this thing can do, is you see the bombing of the 6th Panzer Army supply lines being basically passed off. And it's like, okay, they're out of range of the 8th Air Force. Oh, great. Now they're in range of the 15th Air Force. And so, again, it really shows kind of how effective this is and how much of a pain in the neck this is to German Army commanders and to the Germans themselves. It makes it, and as the lines start shrinking for the Germans, it's getting easier to coordinate these operations, because now there's fewer and fewer targets and they can hit it with, multiple air forces. We go to the last slide. Something I should point out, and again, one of the things that we should think about is, while this does make the strategic air forces much more effective in coordinating and carry out their operations, it also means that when they decide to bomb civilians and bomb cities with area bombing, it also means those operations too are more effective. There's the famous Operation Thunderclap. There's the bombings of Berlin and also Dresden. These are being coordinated with the 8th Air Force and Bomber Command. And because of this improved coordination, this kind of decision to, okay, let's start attacking German cities by the Americans. Let's now move from, okay, well, the transportation centers in the middle city, okay, there's going to be civilian casualties, but the objective is the transportation. And now it's like, well, let's go after the civilians. That same coordination means the effectiveness of attacking civilians also improves, which means this is why we start to see more civilian casualties late in the war. It's one of the many reasons. Beyond the technology that's improving, it's also the ability to bring more pressure to bear, bring more bombers to bear on these targets. And so that is kind of a sad aftermath of all this, is that this also means that Dresden will be conducted in the fashion that it is, and Thunderclap is conducted in the fashion that it is. So again, I'll go to the final slide. I've actually had to make a note in my notepad to update this a little bit. Conclusion, then we'll go to the final slide. We'll go back one slide. I'm sorry about that. I got ahead of myself. If we go,
we're going to the
conclusion.
That one.
Yeah. So sorry about that. So what we see is improving the command structure enabled the Americans to better coordinate and concentrate their air forces against Axis targets. Again, this is not to discount all the advantages they had in 44 versus 43 in terms of materiel and tactics. But what it does do is it basically acts as a force multiplier. When you're able to bring more of that pressure, more of those bombers to bear on a target and assist in a strategic target system, that means you're better able to use the advantages that you already possess. So again, it's a force multiplier. Do I think it alone turned the air war around? No. But again, the way I've kind of started looking at the air work between 43 and 44 is that it's not one or two things. It's not three things. It's not command unity. It's not the long-range escort fighter. It's not the better fighter tactics. I mean, someone needs to do a book on logistics. How logistics match all the new bombers coming in. There are so many more things. If we looked at what happened different in 43 and 44, you will find so many more reasons why we can point to 44 and 45 being a different air war than 42 and 43 being. And again, that's kind of the point I take away. That's kind of my big point. And that's also something I think I would like, the big takeaway from my book to be is that we need to look more at this. We need to look more at, campaigns that we've accepted as happening a certain way. And there are other factors that may have changed that campaign. There are other factors that may have played a role, and so that's something that this is all about, is saying there's another factor at play here. And that is they're now able to basically bring their air force's full might to bear compared to what they were in 43. Again, the other thing that should be pointed out is they also started targeting economic systems that were linked. Transportation and oil were linked together. You hit one and you hit the other, it's going to create an even greater effect. And so that is another thing that I think should be pointed out. Third, the ground war is always going to dictate the air war. This is all about the ground war. I mean, I know as a person who writes on strategic bombing and air power, that's probably, I probably am going to get in trouble for saying that. But the ground war is dictating the pace of the air war. I can't emphasize how much Overlord is forcing basically these command changes. Overlord and the thought in the back of everybody's mind that we need to get this stuff right before Overlord is definitely playing a role here, particularly the command decisions and decisions to basically reset the roster and plug and play people in different positions than what they were. And finally, the working relationships matter. If you don't have the right people working together to coordinate these operations, they're not going to be coordinated. We could talk a little bit about why Big Wing was such a problem in the Battle of Britain at times, because there were some Leigh-Mallory had some, shall we say, personality problems that made it hard for fighter command at some points in the Battle of Britain to work together. Now that they eventually overcame that, but the point being is that ideally, the better the command relationships and the relationships between all the commanders who have to coordinate their forces in the field, the better you will see basically them able to bring greater force to bear on an enemy, not just in the air, but on the ground. And then we go to the last slide, one of the things that I like to kind of look at, as a historian, is I like to see, okay, how does the past kind of affect the present? What lessons can we extrapolate from World War II that happened today? Well, we're seeing command problems with the Russian army in Ukraine. And again, I'm not a Russian army expert. I'm not a Ukrainian army expert. But from a kind of long distance view, we can see that there are problems, particularly early in the war, that the Russian army clearly realized in coordinating their forces. They had problems. It's not the only problem they had. I think we can agree they have a lot more problems than just that. But that was one of the problems they self-identified. And as a result, what they did is in April of 2022, they appointed Colonel General Alexander Dvornikov as the theater commander, the first theater commander in the war. And so it shows that they realized they needed a central command authority to coordinate their forces. And during his time in charge as theater commander, basically we saw better coordination of the Russian forces. And they brought greater force to bear in the Donbass in their attacks at Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. But again, not to get into why he was relieved, but he was fired because I guess there was the Kremlin was unhappy with his progress. He was replaced with another person, and we saw him slip back into the same old problems. Obviously, they've changed that again as of October 8th. And this is the thing I had to basically write down on a notepad before coming in here. As of October 8th, there's a new commander, a new theater commander who's been given a lot of authority to coordinate their forces in the field, Sergei Surovkin. And so Russia's still clearly trying to figure this thing out and what command relationships work and how to coordinate their forces in the field. You can tell they're clearly struggling with this. And we've seen periods where they do it really well and periods where they don't. But what this shows is that if you can coordinate your forces in the field better, if you have a central command authority who can basically say, this is what the objective is, this is what we're going to do, then I think what you can see is you can see it work as a force multiplier for what you have. So that's all I'd say.
Brilliant stuff, Luke. And I'm glad I can say it just adds another bit of an argument for why I have admired Eisenhower for all of my life, because I hadn't really considered how much influence he has on the strategic bombing. I'm just considering as what he did, which we know he did very well, which is oversee the invasion of France on the ground. But you've done a great job keeping all those threads going. And I think it's an example of the kind of thing we're trying to do on this channel, which is combine all the different stories. And you can't study the air war without studying the ground war. You can't study the ground war without studying the air war and the combined ops. And above all, leadership and personalities come into it so much. And it's why I don't want to necessarily keep on doing shows on my channel about aircraft types. I'll let other people do that, because as interesting as that is, it's far more interesting, I think, looking at the developing systems and the doctrine and these leadership changes. So thanks very much for joining us. So we've had requests to bring you back in the future, talking more about the US policy of targeting civilians and whether or not the US admitted that it was a better idea after the war. We've talked, another question that came up is about whether or not targets should have been set that were to do with reducing the horrors of the Holocaust. So targeting some of the concentration camps, death camps, that's something that could come up as well in terms of a future subject. But both of those were too big to bring up in a just a question today, I think.
Oh yeah, and I will say with regards to the bombing of Auschwitz, they did bomb Auschwitz Camp 3, which was the IG Farben facility. So they did bomb that. They did not bomb the rail lines in. That's something I will admit I wish I studied a little more, but I have seen the documents. They did bomb Camp 3, which was the IG Farben facility, which was the synthetic oil. They only bombed it once, but I was kind of surprised when I saw that they had bombed Auschwitz, and I actually had to send an email to one of the great Holocaust experts, Jeff McGargan. I had to say, am I reading this document right? And I sent him the document, and he goes, yeah, you were, he's like, you need to look a little, basically he said there's a lot to this story,
Well, we'll tackle that in the future. Well, we'll bring I'm going to take you off screen for a second. I'll bring you back in a minute. Folks, tomorrow, 2 shows coming your way. There's 2 days this week with 2 shows because of fitting with people's schedules. So 2 shows coming your way tomorrow. But in the meantime, I'm going to bring Luke back in just to say thank you very much. So Luke, thank you very much. And I hope you will stick around and maybe watch some of the other shows if you're in between teaching and other commitments this week, because I think yours has set us up for the week really well. So thank you very much. It's been brilliant talking to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Brilliant. So this is Paul Woodadge from World War II TV saying I'll see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye.